All right, very good. So we've had sort of an erratic schedule, which has put us behind. But after class, I would like to see those of you who are entering the church at Easter time, so either getting baptized or just getting confirmed and making first communion and so on. So we could go through a few little details that we need to do. So, good. So, all right. Any questions since I've been away? We have 2 sacraments to do tonight. Who what? You figured it all out? Good. Then let's go home. So, now we have 2 last sacraments, the sacraments of vocation. So hopefully we can go through these a little bit expeditiously so that we have some time for questions. And then we might have to adjust the schedule a little bit, but next week we start morality. I'd like to at least spend 3 sessions on morality. So with that in mind, let's do what I hope might be the simplest of the 2 first, and that's holy orders. So we know from our discussion on the church that Jesus founded a church. He entrusted his authority to his apostles, and that authority has been handed on. We call that handing on apostolic succession. The sacrament, though, by which a man becomes a bishop, priest, or deacon is all part of the sacrament of holy orders. So as we look at the history of the church, as we've already discussed, the first bishops and priests, it was really the same kind of an office, were the apostles. And then as the apostles saw the church grow, they saw the need for assistance, so we have the institution of deacons. Also, I should have backed up, but remember, right at Pentecost time, the apostles chose St. Matthias to replace Judas, to complete that idea of the 12. So here again, this handing on of the apostolic succession. By the mid-1st century, we see, especially in the letters of St. Paul, how the church has grown, and so bishops have also appointed priests so that they could handle the needs of the church, particularly the sacramental needs. So what we have here is a sacrament that involves, you could say, 3 stages. So we look at this as a character sacrament, meaning that it leaves a permanent mark on the soul. So it's received, you could say, once, but really in 3 kinds of stages, if that makes sense. A little bit of a mystery. So for instance, we think of not only that these offices are different by degree, but also by essence. So there's a big difference between bishop and priest together versus deacon. So let's think of what they can do. So start off in the little low, I could say the bottom of the food chain, the deacon. So anyway, the deacon is ordained, as we hear in Acts of the Apostles, to assist the priests and the bishops, and particularly to assist in the welfare needs of the church. As we read in Acts of the Apostles, they were ordained to care especially for the widows and those who were in need. So with that, the priests do help out in parishes. They can preach and read the gospel, so they can do that. They can also baptize. So that's an ordinary minister of the sacrament of baptism. They can also witness a marriage. So let's put M for marriage here. They can witness a marriage. They can also do a burial service. And that's really it. So they can assist at Mass. So deacons can read the gospel. They can even preach a homily, if permitted. They can baptize. They can witness a marriage. And then also they can do a burial service, like at the graveyard. Now, a priest can do all of those things. But what is most important is a priest who offers the Mass. So he's the one who, we say, confects the Holy Eucharist. Only the priest can act in the person of Christ to say the words of consecration. Priest can also absolve sins. So we think of confession. The priest can anoint the sick and the dying. In special circumstances, the priest can also confirm. So not only can he do all these things, the priest does these. The deacon cannot do these. So it is the priest who offers the Mass. That's the primary role of the priest. Absolve the sins, anoint the sick and the dying, confirm those who are dying or in special circumstances like a convert. The priest can do that by permission of the bishop. And then also the priest preaches the gospel, also does the baptisms, witnesses the marriages, and does the burials. So what does the bishop do? Well, the bishop is the ordinary minister of the sacrament of confirmation because he represents the whole diocese in the church. And now the young person usually a young person is now renewing the baptismal promises and receiving the fullness of the gifts of the Holy Spirit poured out at Pentecost on the apostles to really have, you could say, like an adult role in the church. So the bishop is the ordinary minister of confirmation. But the bishop is the only one who can ordain. So he's the one responsible for the sacrament of holy orders. When it comes to who ordains a bishop, well, then you have not only a primary consecrator, that would be the one bishop, but also two others. So there's always three bishops at an ordination of a bishop to ensure the handing on of apostolic succession. Very interesting. So there you have it. So that's basically the structure of holy orders. Now, any questions so far? Yes. Clarify what? Because you don't want to have any possibility where a bishop does not receive the apostolic authority to ordain others. Because then that would, if the bishop was deficient, that would invalidate the next, if you were ordaining priests. Just like if I were invalidly ordained, guess what? The Eucharist isn't the Eucharist. So the church is very particular in ensuring that the apostolic succession is handed on to the bishops so that they in turn can ordain properly the priests. Yes, Joseph. Yes, it is. Presbyter is just the Greek term for priest. In the earliest times of the church, you hear in the letters of St. Paul, we hear about the bishops, the presbyters, the deacons. Oh, yes. Well, you have the term apostle refers to the 12, and then you have St. Matthias. St. Paul's also given that title because he was called by the risen Lord. But after that, those, you could say, those very particular cases, then those that were ordained after them were simply called bishops. But it was very clear that the apostles were the bishops. Yeah. Okay. Yes, Michaela. Yes. Every bishop technically is an exorcist. That doesn't mean every bishop is trained to be an exorcist. Usually a bishop would appoint a priest to be the diocesan exorcist. No, there should be one, but there doesn't have to be two that I know Unless you have a lot of possessed people in your diocese, maybe. But as far as I know, Our nation. Well, lunatics is one thing, possessed is another. Always remember that. You have to make sure there's a difference between a person who's a lunatic, like a schizophrenic, versus someone who's diabolically possessed. How do we get on this? Yes, Nicholas.
So a bishop ordained by the Pope, would he be acting in his capacity as like the Bishop of Rome? Those two other bishops would still be present?
Yes, still would. So if the Pope, Bishop of Rome, ordains a bishop, you're going to have two other bishops there too. And probably even more, because usually when you think of the ordination of a bishop, that there are usually a good number of bishops present, because it's like a big gathering. It's a celebration.
So the minimum is 3, but it's
yes, exactly. Yes.
Father, what's the role of a Monsignor?
Nothing. Not really. Monsignor is an honorary title. So sometimes in the past it was related to a job, like the chancellor of a diocese was a Monsignor. If you work in the Vatican offices, sometimes the lower officials are given that title, but it's an honorary title. It was usually given by a bishop. Well, it's given by the Pope through the bishop to recognize a priest who has done some kind of good work.
And I also have a follow-up question to my mom's question. How do we know if a priest is an exorcist?
You won't.
To remain a secret?
It is. It is, because let's say I were the diocesan exorcist. I don't want every nutcase calling me in the diocese asking for an exorcism. So before the official exorcist even gets involved, the case has been investigated thoroughly by the medical, meaning psychiatric, other professionals. It's also then investigated usually by a priest. It's referred to the bishop, who says, yeah, this seems like something supernatural, and then the exorcist gets involved. But the person has to want to be exorcised. I mean, you can't force a person, right? Yeah.
You don't volunteer.
No, you got to be kidding. No, I never volunteer. Deal with evil?
I would find it odd if someone wanted to do that.
No. I mean, really, when I've read the accounts of the exorcisms, granted, God always wins, but it's very frightening in a way. You have to have a very strong spiritual fortitude, because you're dealing with evil. You're dealing with the devil. You're dealing with demons. Well, I've never heard of that, but yes. And what? Of exorcisms? Oh. All right, and the bishop is the head shepherd of a diocese. A big diocese is called an archdiocese. And so you have an archbishop in charge of the big diocese. Now, so you think of in our country, usually it's the major cities. You think of like the Archdiocese of New York, Philadelphia, Boston, Baltimore, and so on. Or you take Washington. Now, Washington's really not that big of a city overall, but because it's the nation's capital, that's why after World War II it was made an archdiocese. But before that, it was just part of the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Now, the only real prerogative that the archbishop has is that he is head of the province. So we have the diocese. So in a church, you have parishes, and then you have those little parishes make up the big diocese. And then the dioceses are grouped together in what's called a province. And those bishops in a geographic area will meet together, and the archbishop is head of that province. So like for us, we have the Archdiocese of Baltimore. Included in our province then is Baltimore, but then Wilmington, Delaware, that's the whole state. Then there's Wheeling, Charleston, West Virginia. That's the whole state. Diocese of Arlington, Diocese of Richmond. That's all of Virginia. So periodically, those 5 bishops do get together. And oftentimes that'll include, just because it's so close, the Archdiocese of Washington and its little subdiocese in the province, which is the Virgin Islands. Go figure. And so they will meet to discuss issues that deal with our area. Maybe they'll even issue a letter. Like a few years ago, the province issued a letter about the importance of confession and so on. Now, it also plays into church court cases. So like if a person is pursuing a declaration of nullity here in the Diocese of Arlington, then that would be appealed, if it needs to be appealed, to the Archdiocese level, Baltimore. And if it needs to be appealed from there, it goes to Rome. Or like if I were charged with heresy, it goes from this tribunal in Arlington to Archdiocese of Baltimore to Rome. So there you have it. So it's a functional thing. Now, you asked about Cardinal. Cardinal is another honorary title. Cardinal comes from the Latin cardo, cardinus, which means hinge. Now, in the very early church, the Pope always had 7 advisors. And 7 is just, one of those special numbers. So you had the 7 advisors, and eventually this develops into cardinals. The word cardinal means hinge. So it's a hinge person who's a good advisor, who has a sense of the needs of the church. As time goes on, you have cardinals that are spread throughout the world. Usually, a cardinal is an archbishop because it's a large diocese. They have the province underneath them, so there's more communication. They have a better idea of what's going on. Some cardinals, though, are taken and they're head of congregations like offices in the Vatican, like the Congregation for Divine Liturgy, or there's the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, things like that. So you have these cardinals that have official Vatican kind of roles. The big, you could say, prerogative for a cardinal is that when the Pope dies, they will come together in what is called a consistory and a conclave, and they will, just really by the grace of the Holy Spirit, decide who's going to be the next Pope, usually from among themselves. But it doesn't have to be. It could be someone else. I mean, they could make me Pope. Doubt it, but they could. So, but normally it is among themselves. Okay. Anything else? Okay. All right. So 2 particular questions always come up about the sacrament of holy orders. And one is celibacy. Now, this could take another whole lecture in itself, but in the Jewish priesthood, when the Jewish priests offered sacrifice, now the Jewish priests were married. Okay, so they had marriage, they had families, but they also had, you could say, rotating designated times when actually they had temple duty, depending upon what branch, or you could say what little clan of the tribe of Levi they were. So when it was your turn to have temple duty for a week, you had to abstain from any relationships with your wife for a week prior, and then all during that week. And the idea was you were doing a purification and really dedicating your whole life to God. So that was a Jewish notion of priesthood. Now, during the time, you'd say even 100, 200 years before our Lord, there was a segment of Judaism called the Essenes. And the Essenes were sort of like a monastic community. They did have married members and families, but for the real, you could say the monastic part, they were all celibate priests. This was the Essenes. Now you get into the time of Jesus. So Jesus has his apostles. We hear of Peter's mother-in-law, but we never hear of Peter's wife. We really hear nothing about the apostles as far as being married or having a family after they were apostles. Same with St. Paul. And we go on through the tradition of the early church. There was a little bit of both, that you had those priests that were celibate, and you had those priests who were married, but there was always still that idea of continence, that when the priest was to offer the Mass, he had to be, you could say, celibate 24 hours ahead, and then during the time of that Mass. So there's a little bit of a tension going on as the church grows. So now we're after legalization, especially. So in the 300s, the problems arise. And it first begins with bishops. Like the bishop technically holds the title to church property. So what happened when a bishop died? Well, sometimes his family would be claiming the church property. So one way to solve that, if you want to be a bishop, you have to be celibate. You have no children, you have no wife, you have no kids. And that's the way it is still in the Orthodox Church. You know, in the like the Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, to be a bishop, you have to be celibate, which means most of their bishops are not parish priests, they're monks. Now, back to our church. So also in the 300s, we have monasticism starting to develop. And now there's more of this idea of celibacy. But there's still the tension going on. But by the year 1000, Pope St. Gregory VII declares and makes it mandatory that all priests be celibate. And part of it was because part of managing the affairs of family and marriage versus parish affairs, some of it was other issues involved, like divorce and so on. So Pope St. Gregory said, all right, everyone now is going to be celibate. This is in the Western Church. So that's just a fast little history behind it. And that's been the practice in our church. So a man who wants to be a priest in the Catholic Church takes a vow of celibacy. And the idea is that when you get ordained, you are dying to yourself, rising to a new life to serve Christ. And we're called to serve Christ wholeheartedly. So when you think of two people who get married, well, a husband and wife are dedicating themselves to each other. You know, there's not going to be any, you could say, dating. A husband dates somebody else or a wife dates somebody else. No, they're dedicated to each other. That is the focus of their love. For a priest, the focus is for the Lord. He's identifying with Christ. Jesus was celibate. And so the priest who acts in the person of Christ is identifying particularly with the priesthood of Christ. So this is part of the theology behind the celibacy. It's an act of sacrifice. It's an act of fidelity. A priest is giving his whole life to serve the Lord, but also to serve those entrusted to his care. In a practical sense, too, when you think of my title being father, well, you're the family. Now, if you call me in the middle of the night, I'm going to say, sorry, the office is closed. Call back at 9 a.m. The office will open. Until then, take 2 Tylenol and call me later. No, I'm going to respond. Or I'm not going to say, well, sorry, I can't see you because I'm going to my kid's soccer game. The priest is dedicated to the service of the Lord and his family that's entrusted to his care. Quite frankly, just knowing a couple of Protestant ministers, and especially my friend Father Randy Sly, who I've mentioned, who's the Episcopalian bishop, who became the Catholic priest. He said it was always very difficult to try to balance life, because here you're trying to serve your congregation, and his was very small congregation, versus serving the needs of your family. Oftentimes, the Protestant ministers I know will really share how difficult it is. One, that the wife seems to be almost like a co-pastor involved in things. And then the people are people. You get into the gossipy about the minister's wife, minister's kids, things like this. I had a friend in college whose father was a Methodist minister, and she said it was really tough because his congregation saw more of him than we did. And then everybody's looking at us. You're the minister's kid. It's like you have to live by the standard. So it gets very hard. It can be I could see how that would be very difficult, whereas I have a lot more freedom to give of myself to serve God. And Jesus said that, you can't serve two masters. And it's very difficult, especially for a Catholic priest. We don't just work weekends. We think about daily masses, confessions, things like this. When I think of my life too, a lot of evenings are taken up. Well, when are the kids home from school? In the evening. So it's very hard. So celibacy, Pope St. John Paul II said, is a gift, meaning it's freely given in the sense that God gives us the grace that we need to live it, and the priest freely gives of himself, accepting that gift. So anyway, be thankful for your priest. Sometimes people will say, well, why can't priests get married and so on? They should be married and all that. It's like, the only people that want us to get married are the are the married people. Maybe it's misery loves company. I don't know. But anyway, and reminds me of another story. Well, Father Sly and I were at it was one of our diocesan events, priest meeting. And we were sitting having lunch, and there were more of our four, avant-garde liberal kind of priests there. And they were questioning him about this. Don't you think priests should get married and so on? And he said, absolutely not. I can tell you what it's like as an Anglican bishop. It's not easy. So there you have it. Any questions about that? Go ahead.
There are some rights within the church where
Yes. So the eastern side of the church. So what I just mentioned is for our Latin Rite Catholics. Eastern Rite of the church. That you do have, like the Byzantine Rite, Melkite Rite, and so on. Those priests can be married before they're ordained. Once they're ordained, then they cannot get married. Okay. Also, exceptions have occurred. So like Father Sly, for instance, he is married, so he became a Catholic priest. That's an exception. And he's not responsible for his own parish either. He assists. He's principal of a high school, but he's not responsible for his own parish because he has his other obligations. Now, his kids are grown, but he does have a wife. So anyway, but those are all exceptions. So that's a church discipline. There's something, it could be changed, but I doubt it. I really doubt it. And no one should go into being a priest thinking, well, they're going to change the rule. No. People ask me about, would you want to get married? I said, not at this point in my life. Who wants to marry me at this point? No, of course not. So anyway, any other questions? Yes.
So, Father, for those churches, such as the Eastern Catholic churches, those are the ones in full communion with us?
Yes.
Could you elaborate on something?
What do you mean?
Like on the Eastern churches, like how they're in full communion with us, for example?
Well, it's just in the history of the church. Each culture had different traditions. So in the Western side of the church, Latin became the primary language. And even as far as, say, traditions like in the Western side, you're going to see statues and stained glass windows, Gothic architecture, things like this. In the Eastern side, it's more the Byzantine. Greek was the predominant language. And then they have the icons. And you won't find really many statues of any at all. It's mostly icons. You go into their churches and the icons are really all over, sometimes covering all the walls. But the Mass, the theology is the same. There's going to be a little bit difference to the way Mass is offered, because in the Orthodox or in the Byzantine churches, you'll see like an altar screen that the priest goes through. It's called an iconostasis. But these are just cultural things. Now, some of those churches always remained in union with the Pope. But then when the 1054, when the Patriarch of Constantinople thought he should be Pope because Rome had declined so much and excommunicated the Pope returned the favor and so on, that some of those churches broke off. So we have Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox, Romanian Orthodox, and so on. Later on, some of those churches or parts of them came back. And that's why there's a Ukrainian Orthodox Church, but there's also a Ukrainian Catholic Church, Eastern Rite Catholic Church. So like if you go down near Fairfax Hospital, there is Epiphany Byzantine Catholic Church in union with Rome. There's on Lewinsville Road, there is Holy Transfiguration Melkite Rite Catholic Church. So they keep some of their cultures. Like I've been to ceremonies at Holy Transfiguration, and they use usually English, but sometimes they use, it's like an Arabic, I guess. It's Melkite, so like a sort of a Lebanese Melkite. And they have lots of incense, lots of icons. And if you want a long liturgy, go there because it's like 2 hours long. Lots of chanting, so get ready for it. Yeah. There you go. Okay. All right. Next, boy, we're moving on. Okay, so next question that's come up, why not women priests? Well, we never had women priests. That's the first reason. So in the tradition of our church, in the history, we never see women being ordained as priests. Now, some people say, well, that's because Jesus lived in those times and so on. Well, that's true. Jesus lived in times where in Judaism, rabbis did not deal with women. Rabbis taught men. And that's the way it was. And even in Judaism, pretty much it's still very male-dominated. Even my Orthodox Jewish endocrinologist would say that, because I've asked him questions about things, and he's about, when it says the firstborn, who's the firstborn? Is it both boys and girls? He says, no, it's always refers to the boys because they count. That's the Orthodox Jewish endocrinologist. And he's being a little bit sarcastic with that, but still, so Jesus, though, is radically different. You have Mary Magdalene, for instance. You have other women who follow Christ. Rabbis didn't do that. And he's even noted for that by the Pharisees. Radically different. And then if you could think that if anyone deserved to be a priest, it would have been our Blessed Mother. After all, she was all holy. She gave birth to our Lord. She stood at the foot of the cross. She was there at Pentecost. But never does it say she was a priest. So the tradition is that Christ gave his priesthood to his 12 apostles, and it's been passed on. Sacramentally also, the priest represents the person of Christ. So the idea of the male identity is also important. That doesn't mean anything about women are lesser or something like that. It's just who is Christ and who represents Christ. And so therefore, the priest in our Catholic Church has always been male. Now, does that mean women are lesser? No. Pope St. John Paul II, when he was in this country way back in 1979, addressed this issue, and he said, everyone in the church has a mission. We all play a role. Just like St. Paul talked about the body, or the body of the church being like a human body, different organs, different functions, but they always work together, he said, under the headship of Christ. Same thing. You can't say, well, the heart's more important than the lungs, because what good is a heart without your lungs, right? What good is your heart and your lungs without your liver? It doesn't work. Same thing with the church. So even though we have maybe not everybody can do everything the same, doesn't mean that it's any lesser. I can't be a parent in the fullest sense. Does that make me lesser? Some people never get married, but do a wonderful service to the church. Some people become dedicated brothers or sisters, religious. It's a great service to the church. So the key here is not to get into the politics of it all, but to think about what did Christ give to the church and how am I called to serve the church? Right now, I would say one of the great crises in our church is the lack of the domestic church. When you think about an important mission, it's being a holy husband and wife who are dad and mom. Really, you look at our society today, it's so fragmented. You see the divorce, you see kids that are raised most of their life without a father, so many children born out of wedlock, especially in the minority communities. So we need to have that vocation. Those, people shouldn't be worrying so much about, well, I should be a priest. No, they ought to be worried about doing what they're called to do. All right, any questions about that?
About a year ago, I read that there are 3,000 parishes in the U.S. that have no priests.
Mm-hmm.
So how's the church going to solve that problem? They're never going to ordain women. So it makes sense
Well,
to allow young men, because also seminaries are no longer attracting young men.
oh, it all depends. Aha! It all depends. See, and here you see a mystery of the Holy Spirit. Because our little diocese that has 70 parishes has 50 men right now studying to be priests. You look, because we're a good diocese. We're orthodox. We're faithful. You don't go to any church and have lunatic mass. When you have dioceses that have weak leadership, lunatic masses, poor teaching, what young man wants to serve? So it's the Holy Spirit purifying those individuals. Same thing with religious communities. Why is it the little Dominican Sisters of Mary Mother of the Eucharist, started in 1999, has 130 young sisters and the average age is 28? And they wear habits, the Dominican Sisters, and they teach school, and they live a prayerful life. A young lady from my last parish joined them. She's now 6 years in vows. And they're all happy. I've been to the mother house. It's like so much energy, you want to just go crazy. I mean, it's just, they're happy. But why? They've got an identity. They know what they're doing. Why is it these orders that went wacko, decide, well, we'll get rid of our habit and we can wear pantsuits and earrings and do our bouffant hairdos, have no vocations. They gave it up. So it's all a purification of the Holy Spirit.
Is that figure that I read wrong? I can't remember what the source was, but it's 3,000 in the U.S. that don't have.
I have no idea, but another problem is that bishops are reluctant to close parishes. We're seeing a demographic shift in our country because if you go to the Northeast especially, big cities like even Philadelphia, Boston, the population has moved. I remember in Philadelphia when I was in seminary, this one parish, so you had Nativity Parish, that was the normal parish. And then one block down was St. Adalbert's Polish Parish. One block over was, I think it was Holy Rosary Lithuanian Parish. One block over that way was Our Lady of Pompeii Italian Parish. Across the street was Mary Help of Christians German Parish. That's 5 parishes.
All I can think is the food must have been fabulous on those.
Well, it was, but the neighborhood has totally changed. Totally changed. And yet some of these bishops try to keep these things going, and a poor priest might be responsible for 3 parishes. A priest friend of mine who is only like 8 years ordained responsible for 2 parishes. And really what needs to happen is the bishop, and it's heartbreaking when you have to say to people, you don't have the support here. You don't have the bodies. You got to keep up the facility. I mean, pay your light bill. You got to fix the roof that's leaking and so on. And how does one priest serve 2 small communities that could be really 1? That's a problem. See? But nobody asks me for all these solutions. No one. Probably because of the way I talk, wacko nuns and things like this, some of them. But there are some really good new religious orders. You know, I mentioned Dominican Sisters of Mary, Mother of the Eucharist, the Dominican Sisters in Nashville. They know who they are. See? And so it's very vibrant. There's a Benedictine monastery, Clear Creek in Oklahoma. It's thriving. There's a Carmelite monastery in Cody, Wyoming. It's thriving with young vocations. People are looking. Really, vocations are there. But if you're going to be a young person, you're looking for also leadership. You're going to give your life. You want an identity. You want a community life, right? You don't go into it just to be a glorified professional. So, oh well, enough of my rampage, tirade, whatever. All right, any other questions?
So, Father, when we see Jesus being presented by his mother to the high priest Simeon, there's also mention in the Bible of this priestess named Anna.
Nope. Prophetess.
Are there any priestesses?
Not in Judaism. See, and that's radical too, because in the sense that you think of all the surrounding cultures, Greek, Roman, and so on, they had priestesses. They did. But Jesus didn't institute a church that way. So even in the times of the very early church, with persecution, you had the priestesses of Venus and things like that, but not in the Catholic Christian church. All right, now, okay, gang. Moving right along here. Behind schedule, but that's okay. Matrimony. Now I'll pick on you all. Okay, so let's go to the good old gospel. Now, actually, let's go to Genesis, because this is very important. Chapter 1. God creates. So we know it's not a science book, but as we went through way back in September or October, God created out of his love. He created with purpose, design, order. It flows over 7 days. 7 was a perfect number. What he created was good. So there you have it. Come to on the 6th day, verse 27. It says, God created man in his image. In the divine image, he created him. Male and female, he created them. It's not Facebook 70 different genders or something. No, male and female, he created them. God blessed them, saying, be fertile and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. It's marriage. It's the family. There you have it. Then we go to chapter 2, and we have God creating man from his rib. He creates his wife, Eve. And then we go on, and it says, when God brought her to the man said, this one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. This one shall be called woman, for out of her man, this one has been taken. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and clings to his wife, and the 2 of them become one body. It's a very beautiful verse. When you think about those 2 verses, here you have God making us. Each one of us reflects that image of God. God gave us not just a body, he gave us the soul, a rational soul, intellect and free will, so that we could choose to love God. Now in this mystery, you have a man and a woman. So both reflect God's image. But what we know they're different. We know they're different physically, physiologically. If you're married, you know you're different psychologically too, right? You know, men and women do think differently. Ask any married couple that. So, how do you get the best picture of God's image when you have man and woman coming together in marriage? And when we look at the second chapter of Genesis, that's the idea. So from the man was created the woman. So how do you get the original unity back? The completeness back? It's in marriage, when the two become one flesh. And what makes us really physically different? It's our reproductive organs, the way we're made to reproduce children. So in God's plan, you have a man and a woman who are really united as one to complete themselves, but also to participate in God's creative love. Here, the love that brings them together, they're joined as one by God. They're promising a love that is faithful, permanent, exclusive, self-giving, but a love that is life-giving. And so in union with God, that love may overflow in the creation of a child. And a child's a miraculous gift. And that's what we don't appreciate, that a child is a unique human being with that body and soul. There's never going to be another child like that. And we've lost that a life is a precious gift. Well, keep that in mind. And Jesus, in the Gospel of St. Matthew, gives a beautiful teaching on marriage. He does so in all the Gospels, but in Matthew in particular, he's asked about the question of divorce. So in chapter 19, it says, some Pharisees came up to him and said to test him, may a man divorce his wife for any reason whatsoever? Well, any reason. So it's a test. Because in Judaism, you had different rabbinic schools. And there are two great rabbis. One was Rabbi Shammai, who was very strict. So the idea of divorce meant adultery. If a person committed adultery, you could get a divorce. But Rabbi Hillel was more liberal. And so since adultery was infidelity, well, Rabbi Hillel said, well, if a wife goes outside without her veil on, that's being unfaithful. You could divorce her. Or if your wife burns dinner, that's infidelity. You could divorce her. Remember that. And in Judaism, it's the man who could divorce the wife, not vice versa. So Jesus is put to this rabbinic test. He replies, have you not read that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female and declared? So he goes back to Genesis. And in Genesis, it's man and woman, okay, united permanently. Also, no polygamy. Polygamy doesn't come up until after the fall of Adam and Eve and original sin starts moving on. No divorce until the time of Moses. So, continue on. And declared, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become as one. Thus they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, let no man separate what God has joined. They said to him, then why did Moses command divorce and the promulgation of the divorce decree? Because of your stubbornness, Moses let you divorce your wives. Jesus replied, but at the beginning it was not that way. I now say to you, whoever divorces his wife, this is parenthetical, lewd conduct is a separate case, and marries another commits adultery, and the man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Lewd conduct here is referring to incestuous unions, because in pagan societies, it was not always uncommon for an incestuous union between even a brother and a sister to be married, like Emperor Caligula. Or you have a uncle marrying his niece, things like that. So in this case, it's not even a marriage to start with. But when Jesus is saying that when you have a man and a woman who become husband and wife. There's an indissoluble bond. They're promising a faithful, sacrificial, life-giving love. And that love is so good, it may overflow in the creation of children. All right. Any questions? Nicholas.
Then, like, what cases of adultery?
Aha! Okay, so divorce does occur. Okay, so divorce is a civil action. Now, first of all, with adultery, so I've known couples that have made, one or both even, have made a mistake, committed adultery, truly repentant, and they've worked it out. That's wonderful. And that's really the sacrificial love. When you take vows, good times, bad, sickness, and health, you've just hit the worst time, right? But you're taking those vows. I love you in good times and bad, sickness and health. So not always easy to lead or to live. It's, in marriage preparation, we have couples take a questionnaire. And it's just like answering agree, disagree, undecided. They take it individually, and then you match up the answers and see how they do and so on. It's not a compatibility test, more of a communication. Have they talked about issues? And one of the questions, and it's the toughest question, is if my spouse were unfaithful, I could not remain married. Ooh, tough one. If my spouse were unfaithful, I could not remain married. Well, most of them put down undecided. So it's a tough question. And granted, so I discuss it with them, but the point is, so someone falls, someone is truly repentant, asks for forgiveness, and yes, forgiveness should be given. And I've known couples that have worked through it. It doesn't mean it's easy. It's not. It's not easy at all. And what needs to be done is it's not just the action of adultery, but one has to think, why? Why did this occur? See, that's the key too, because there might be issues of communication or something else that led to this. What was it that motivated this one person or even both to have this problem? Be that as it may. What if it's a chronic problem? Okay. Or you get into something like chronic alcoholism, or maybe there's a drug abuse problem, or maybe spousal abuse of some kind. Well, it might be that as a last resort, you have a divorce because you have to protect yourself. And sadly, I've even had to counsel a couple of people to say, you really need to, if this person's not going to change, you do need to protect yourself. You need to protect the kids. And so the only option, sad to say, is the divorce. But divorce is simply the state of Virginia saying the contract is broken, no longer binding. It's over and done with. We set up the different legal responsibilities, rights, and so on and so forth. Done. But the problem is that marriage is a sacrament. So that when man and woman take vows, we presume that those vows are valid, that they really intend to live and mean those vows. Good times, bad, sickness and health, till death do us part. But what happens if there was a defect in the consent? Well, then maybe the vows were null from the very beginning, right at the point of marriage. So the church offers, and you could say, an investigation, a process, and could issue what is called a declaration of nullity. Oftentimes, this is called an annulment. I don't like the word because it's too confusing with the civil law. But rather, it's a declaration of nullity, meaning that the vows were null and void from the very beginning. So what would be something that would cause a defect in consent. Something like force. So let's say that a family arranged the wedding and the couple, one or both, didn't want to be really part of it, but the family's sort of arranging, pressuring, and so on. Well, that could be an issue of force and therefore be a defect in consent. Person's being forced into it, but not really consenting. Just like you can't force a contract and have it be binding. I can't put a gun to a person's head and say, sign on the dotted line and have it really be valid. It's not. So that's a problem of force. Or maybe there's a pregnancy involved. They've been playing house, but they really don't love each other, but they have a baby, so we have to get married. Well, not necessarily. Marriage is different from having the baby and being responsible. Or let's say a person is just under pressure. Like I knew a case where everyone's getting married. I need to get married too. And this young woman, and she was actually more in her mid-30s, but just was getting this whole pressure about I have to get married, the biological clock's ticking and so on. And quite frankly, she picked a loser. But they got married, they got divorced in a year, they got annulled too. So anyway, those are issues of force. Another one could be psychological, that a person could have a serious psychological problem. You think of schizophrenia or what they call bipolar manic depression. Those all have to be issues that are taken into account. Now, that doesn't necessarily prevent the marriage as long as it's under control and so on, but it would have to be investigated. Like I remember, I had a couple, and the parents have to sign what are called these affidavits of freedom forms, which means like, I'm like the father of so-and-so, and I've known the person so long, and my son has never been married before and so on, and my son has no problems or barriers or things like that. And so this father called me up and he said, Father, do you realize that my daughter's insane? I said, no. Well, apparently she was schizophrenic. Nobody knew. I didn't know. The groom didn't know. That had to be dealt with. See? Because that could be a problem in consent. Or if a person is an alcoholic or a drug abuser, that could cause problems. Or even addicted to pornography. That's a problem in consent. Are you really giving your whole love to this person? Those are all psychological issues that could prevent the consent. Or what about infidelity? If a person is unfaithful before the marriage, that person's not going to be faithful after the marriage. I had a case where the groom and bride got married. And after a year or two, got divorced. And it turns out, because she was having affairs, but it turns out when all this was getting investigated, the night before the wedding, she slept with the best man. Now that's a defect of consent, if I ever thought of one. So, or I had another case where a lady came in and she said that she got married, was divorced. It was another year or 2 years. And I said, well, tell me about the circumstances. And she said, well, I was really in love with this man, but he used cocaine and he beat me and he's an alcoholic. Why'd you marry him? Oh, I loved him. I thought I could change him. Well, what did he do after the wedding? Oh, he still used cocaine. He still was an alcoholic and he still beat me and I divorced him. That's an annulment. Really, when you think about it, those are grounds for a declaration of nullity. It was not a marriage from the very start. So the church gathers all this information. So each diocese does it a little bit differently. In our diocese, you go see your parish priest. He'll help you complete the paperwork. So it's an investigation. You have to tell the story. What happened? How did you meet? What was the courtship? What's your family background? Because all that is part of the package too, your family background. And at the time of the wedding, then after the wedding, and so on, put it all together. You get testimony from 3 people who knew both of you before, during, afterwards, and you might have to have a psychological assessment. Father Pinizzato does those for the tribunal. It all gets wrapped up together and a decision's made. There you go. But what the church is saying is that the sacrament did not take place. Yes, there was a bond. You could say there was a civil bond. There was a natural bond. Has nothing to do with the children. So it doesn't affect children at all. It doesn't say children are illegitimate. It just says there is not a binding till death do us part set of vows to this sacrament. The sacrament did not take place. Good? Got it? Yes. All right. Yes. Yeah. Well, not too much because she wasn't Catholic, he wasn't Catholic, and she wanted to get married to a Catholic. See, so because if you aren't, so like, Oh, I did. But I mean, if you were just, let's say, if you were a Protestant, let's say 2 Lutherans, you could just go to the justice of the peace. You don't need to get.
Would say they were both Catholic. Would there be any difference if they gave consent to knowing these things beforehand? Would they still be?
Well, one, if I knew it, which hopefully I wouldn't marry him. For one thing, I don't think any priest in his right mind would say you're ready for marriage. But no, just because, still, it's not just him either, it's her. Anybody who thinks, I can change this person, something's wrong there, psychologically too. You said it, I didn't. But that's true. No, some people think, I can change this person. No.
The investigation is done at the parish level, but the decision is made by the bishop.
Depends upon the diocese. In our diocese, the initial investigation is done here, but then I send it all to the tribunal. The tribunal will, which is really, generally it's just a priest and another priest that just, meet the person, explain the process, go through all the paperwork, ask questions because, you have to clarify things. And then after they ask all those questions, then they will send out questionnaires to the 3 witnesses and also to the former spouse, because there's 2 sides to every story. So the former spouse does not have to respond, but has to be given the opportunity. Okay, so, because you never know. I mean, people do lie, even though all this is under oath. And then they may say, because of the circumstances, we want you to go through an assessment. It's so like Father Pinizzato does these assessments, and it deals more of a psychological basis. And then all of that is gathered up in a 3-judge panel. And judge don't think, these are priests, also lay people too, that want to help an individual, but also be true to justice. So it's not something like Judge Judy or something like that. So, or a regular divorce court. And then they'll render a decision.
And are there fees?
No.
Varying stories.
Depends upon the diocese, not in our diocese. No fees. Used to be, but not now. Bishop Burbage said no fees. And part of the fees were just for the paperwork. You've got staff here. Yeah. Yes.
So, how long is that process?
Well, some of it, usually a year. And the only reason why is you get into queues. And some of it depends upon how fast your witnesses respond. And there are time settings on this. The witnesses are important. Or like the former spouse has a certain time period to respond. If he or she chooses not to, eventually the clock clicks in and says, okay, had your time, we move on. So that's the thing. A lot of it's just what we used to call queuing theory in production management. You just go through the process. But because of the volume, it's about a year. Yeah. Yes. What? Yes.
Now it's very civil to me. Like, where's the Holy Spirit? Who supports these people? Do we have enough support in the diocese and churches break them up, or was it
Well,
deal with, like, did they deal with this? Do we have enough of those in our churches to support?
well, I think we have a good bit of support. Actually, you have a lot more marriage preparation than you do in the old days. Like, I asked my parents when I was just a young priest, I said, all they did was go to my mom's pastor, who knew both of them. He interviewed them, set the wedding date, and that was it. But life was different. You had stable homes. You didn't have the divorce rate we have now. You had stable homes. You had people who practiced the faith. Faith was important, whether you were Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, whatever. And that's why we had stable marriages. And then you have crazy 60s. And what do we see in the 60s? The time of revolution. Divorce rate starts increasing. And also, it went from having to prove a grounds for divorce, like adultery, to no fault divorce. No fault. So anybody, for any reason, could go and get a divorce. No longer did the state uphold the sanctity of marriage or even the family. And it goes on. And then you see the decline in religion and faith. No wonder. When you look at people today, more and more young people don't even get married. They live together. In some recent survey, I forget exactly, but it's almost like the number of people just living together versus those who are getting married is about the same. And yet the living togethers are still having children and so on. But the whole idea of stable family and a long-term commitment isn't there. Psychiatrists will also tell you that children, and half of American children are raised in divorced homes, that most likely they might divorce because they've been raised in a culture where there isn't a permanent commitment, where you really try to work out the problems. It's easy to divorce. It's sad. So it has to be a whole culture shift. And that's why faith is so important. I can tell you right now, probably my parents could have had an annulment, because they went through tough times. They did, whether it was financial or other reasons, but they believed in their marriage. And they believed this was a sacrament and this was till death do us part. So there you have it. So it's a whole cultural shift we're dealing with. Right now, we think about a third of Catholics go to church regularly. That's sad. Because if you really want to have a solid marriage, you need God. And I don't care what religion you are, you need God. You need to know that there is a divine presence and there's something holy about this union of husband and wife and children. That's what you need. And I think many young people are looking for that because they've seen the devastation. They are looking for that.